So thanks for having me at CanBIM. You heard a little bit about me. I think the thing that I've been really lucky in my career is that I've been able to work across all different kinds of geos all along, anywhere around the world. And really for the 360 view of all the stakeholders. So I've worked for both government and private companies, as big giant builders, tier one builders, working with lots of big architects, working with a lot of end users and understanding the drivers. So I'm very lucky to do that. I'd love to get to know you guys a little bit. So I've just started a poll that'll show up on your screen. And if you could just let me know a little bit about who you are, I'd love to know who I'm talking to. In the meantime, just so you know, I'm always on LinkedIn, and you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty responsive, want to see the industry get better. It's one of the reasons I came to Autodesk, because I felt like Autodesk really had the platform and the product portfolio to make the biggest influence on the industry. So that's really why I came. So I'm going to let you guys take that poll so I can get to know a little bit about you guys. I see a lot of BIM managers and some good sales and marketing guys. That's always good. Some VDC and some engineers. I love my engineers. They think logically. That's always good. Shout out to my engineers. So Jay talked a little bit about language. And so this is a technical presentation. I wanted this to be very educational. I think what's going on in our industry a lot of times is there's this thing called word salad. We just eat it right up. It's called word salad. We put all these words in that sound good. We really don't know what anything means. We kind of have an idea and we mix up all these concepts. And then when we're talking about things, we're talking about them again, like everyone's a little bit confused. It's almost like we're all speaking a different language and trying to communicate. So I wanted to start with my title, actually says Industrialized Construction. The reason for that is it's an overarching principle that means the application of manufacturing techniques to the built environment. And that means to concept, to design, to pre-con, to construction, all the way through operations of the building and even circular economy. So I'm looking at things holistically, almost like a manufacturer would, applying it to the built environment. So that's what industrialized construction means. So recently, Rix and Autodesk did a white paper, and it's called The Future of Work. And we talked about some megatrends in industrialized construction. So you see prefabrication there as one of the megatrends. You also see robotics and automation, big data and analytics. I feel like at Autodesk, I'm all about the data. That's so important for us. Internet of Things and things like additive manufacturing. So things like 3D printing. Today, I'm going to focus on prefabrication and some of the enabling methodologies that help some of these things. So you see there's obviously the cloud. You have to get on the cloud, guys. If we didn't learn that from what just went on at COVID, on the maturity stack, the first thing we need to do is we got to get digitized, right? Lean manufacturing is another one of those enablers. DFMA, which I will teach a little about today, Design for Manufacturing and Assembly. Another, it's a big enabler of prefabrication. It's the big enabler for prefabrication. And also BIM. So we'll talk a little bit about BIM for those of you out there. I see a bunch of BIM managers, so this will be good. I'll do a little bit of focus for you guys and my VDC guys, right? So that's what we're really going to do, a little bit of focus. I'm going to cut out some of the noise. Today, we're really going to focus on these three things: prefabrication as a mega trend of IC, and DFMA and BIM. All right, so let's just level set on what we're talking about today. I think, luckily, since we have a lot of BIM managers on here, we know what BIM is, right? So I want to say that, I'm really lucky enough to have talked to Phil Bernstein and work with Phil Bernstein here at Autodesk, who really understood the strategy for and the importance of why BIM was going to be very, very useful for us in the future. He's a thought leader about BIM. He's the one that actually envisioned how this would impact our industry. But intelligent 3D model-based processes, really giving, again, the whole life cycle of the built environment, giving those professionals a lot more insight and tools to really be more efficient. And I look at BIM like the highway. So if you think of BIM as like the Autobahn, for those of you who have been to the Autobahn, we've really laid this amazing highway with BIM. But if we don't have cars moving down it, then the highway is just an empty highway, right? So I look at BIM as the great enabler, one of the great enablers to drive fast cars down it. So prefabrication is one of those fast cars. And so I think we have to think of things in terms like that. The end game is not to get on BIM. The end game is to utilize BIM to enable other innovations, things like prefab, and all kinds of other stuff we're doing at Autodesk. So just think of BIM like that, as almost like when you go to the carnival, you have to be this tall to ride the ride. That's how I feel about getting digitized on the cloud and enabling BIM in order to do better prefabrication, right? So Let's talk again about language. Some people think prefab is just this, right? So they'll ask me, they'll interchange some words like modular and prefab and I don't know, panelization, lots of different words. And they really think that the end all hierarchy be all. In fact, I had somebody yesterday tell me, well, we all know that the holy grail is to go modular. And I thought, well, no, actually, that's not true at all. This is not the holy grail. This is actually just one tool in a toolkit of, a big toolbox that happens to be appropriate sometimes. And other times it's not appropriate at all. So I just want to make sure that we all realize that modular is not a hierarchy. It's not at the top of some food chain somewhere. This happens to be volumetric modules, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But it's sort of my fault, I always say, that we focus on these big, sexy projects, right? So like I've worked in Singapore for the government there. I've worked with a lot in New York on some tall volumetric modular buildings. And it's kind of the thing that the news likes to show us, right? Like hospital in China, 4 days and 57-story high rise. It's sort of that soundbite that sounds good. So everybody really talks a lot about it, which is why we think that this is the end all be all. But it's actually not true. I want to really get a little bit deeper in the levels about what prefabrication is, right? This job is a 14-year-old job. This is not new, right? So this job actually got built. So I just happen to be showing the drawing from it. But it has a lot of pieces and parts that aren't volumetric modules, right? It's creating the space with lots of pieces and parts. And I like to think of projects as usually I look for prefabrication in two different ways where you could use prefab, which would be very helpful. The first is in something like this, where things can be cellular and repetitive in nature. Now, we don't have too many architects on here, but I will tell you that not every architect, even though something could be repetitive, they don't necessarily design it to be repetitive, right? So I say could because I know in a lot of jobs that things can be cellular and repetitive in nature, and I'm trying to find out what those things could be. Like here, you see these bathroom pods and this head wall, this prefabricated head wall that has pneumatic tubing in it and all the MEP. That's the wall right behind the patient's bed. We have distribution racks for mechanical, electrical, plumbing. You have exterior wall panels. And so all of these pieces and parts actually came together to create the space instead of shipping air in the volumetric module, right? So whenever I have to ship expensive air, I think, what can I break down into pieces and parts? So the next place I always look is where the money is, right? Show me the money. You've probably seen that video. And so I think, where are the most expensive spaces, right? The most expensive spaces are things like plant rooms or, mechanical penthouses, processing skids, really places that have large, complex racks, even elevators. So I'm looking to decouple the most complicated bits out and build them concurrently while the site work is going on, while there's work being done on site. Because those really complicated spaces, what happens with them is there's something called trade stacking. And we have to put a lot of different trades in a really small space, and they sort of have to climb over each other. And that's where a lot of the effort and energy comes from, coordinating the work. Interestingly enough, one of the first jobs I ever did with prefabricated bathroom pods, those assemblies, I said to the superintendent on the job site, what was the best part about having these bathroom pods? And I thought he was going to say, well, the quality was perfect, or, it was great. We didn't have all these people on site. And actually what he said was, the best thing about it was I got 7 a day. And I thought, oh, that's strange. What do you mean? And he said, it was the only thing I could count on every day, that I was going to get 7 things with a very finite scope. And what I did was I organized all my work around those 7 pods coming every single day, those 7 assemblies showing up on site. It was the one thing he had that was certain, that he could really base all of the other uncertainties around. And it's sort of, I call it chaos to order theory. Anytime you have something that is very orderly and coming in a tack time, like we say in manufacturing, that's very repetitive and consistent, you can schedule your work around it. So a lot of these big spaces, if we decouple them and reinsert them back into the jobs, it takes a lot of our effort away from being able to focus on the rest of the job, and removing this makes it that much more efficient. You gain a lot of value by removing things from the job site and building them concurrently like this instead of consecutively. So think concurrency gains you value. So I think of prefabrication more of a continuum, right? So it's anything, by the way, and I only use the word prefabrication. I'll talk to you about the word offsite next, but offsite doesn't necessarily mean prefabrication. What prefabrication is a very broad term that means creation of building elements. So for me, those 4 things underneath are just called elements. And They're built in a controlled environment and they're transported to the final destination and hopefully installed on site using accelerated assembly methods. The first one you see there is called Advanced Building Products. So that particular product that you see there is called Blaze Frame. It's intumescent tape that's attached to track. You buy it like that from the manufacturer and you just shoot it up into the ceiling. So it eliminates the need for messy fire caulk. And so then you don't have the person on site with the dirty fire caulk and it's got to open up the tube and squish it out. And I don't know if I got the whole tube. I threw away the tube. Now that's wet. I got to get people around him. So it's reduces drying time, curing time, waiting time, hot work, anything in that advanced building products area. That's what that does, right? It decreases waste. Single trade assemblies, that's just like it sounds. It could be an electrical assembly. It could be a plumbing assembly. It could be a light gauge wall panel assembly, but single trade and usually somewhat simple that I can control. Honestly, oftentimes single trade assemblies don't even really need to be designed into the project because they're usually done by means and methods from the subcontractors. But if we ask for more of them, if we judge subcontractors based on their ability to provide single trade assemblies, the job site has less people on it. It has less chaos. It has a lot of people that are easier to manage. It's a safer job site. So those single trade assemblies are happening every single day. Multi-trade assemblies, like the one you see there, is a bathroom pod. We talked a little bit about that, and I told you with the superintendent. So that bathroom pod and all those assemblies that are multi-trade can be volumetric in nature or non-volumetric in nature, right? So they could be things like that distribution rack that I mentioned running down the hallway. It could be that multi-trade assembly you see there, which is a bathroom pod. It could be a plant room skid. And then you get to volumetric modules. Volumetric modules, again, not a hierarchy. They could be any material. That one I'm showing happens to be steel and concrete. I think that one is actually 14 years old on my presentation. I should update some photos. But honestly, this is not new, and I want you to know that. And so they can be concrete, they can be precast, they can be mass engineered timber. That one I'm showing is concrete and steel. It could be a lightweight with cementitious board and light gauge, lots of different kinds of modules. But it is the structure of the building. That's the difference. It can actually have a secondary structure. In many countries, there needs to be a secondary structure attached, depending on how tall you're going with these volumetric modules. But it does create the space. It creates the whole entirety of the building. So my next poll question, how many of you are using some of these prefabricated elements? I'm going to start the poll, and I'm going to let you answer. So those advanced building products that you're using, any of the single trade assemblies, multi-trade assemblies, and volumetric modules. If you're using more than once, you want more than one of them, you can click on it. The thing I want to go through is that just because you're doing volumetric modules, you could be building that like a conventional construction company under a roof. The more you can use, like I call it the Russian doll effect, the more you can put advanced building products into assemblies and have assemblies go into modules, the better off your project's going to be. We have to, again, it's applying that manufacturing technique to the built environment. So lots of people, just like I would expect, using single trade assemblies, few more using multi-trade, and actually a pretty good percentage using volumetric modular. So that's pretty good as well. Advanced building products, I don't have a lot of architects on this call. I think if we had more architects on this call, they would be thinking what they spec. That's an advanced building product, right? So that's a good indicator. Thank you guys for filling out that poll. So let's talk a little bit about DFMA. DFMA does not mean prefab. Oh, by the way, I said I would talk about offsite. Offsite is literally just location specific. If I go back to prefabrication, so it's either prefabrication offsite. Sometimes prefabrication is done on-site. For those of you who have seen what's going on in London at the Mace building, they have a little factory at the top of their high-rise. Sometimes there's things that are near the job site. So offsite just literally denotes location for prefabrication. So DFMA is not prefab. It doesn't mean prefab. It actually comes from the manufacturing terms, design for manufacturing and design for assembly. Design for manufacturing is basically choices that you make from a design perspective that make it easy for that manufacturer to manufacture their product, right? So the best way I can describe that is at AU, Autodesk University last year, we had a precast company that came in and talked about their precast panels. And he said, these are the 45 instructions for creating this precast panel that you need to know, Mr. Architect and Engineer. If you follow all 45 of my design for manufacturing instructions, I'll give you the full discount. If you only follow 40 of them, I'm going to give you half that discount. And if you follow less than 40 of them, I'll be more expensive than conventional, and you should go conventional. He was explaining his design for manufacturing principles so that he didn't have to do changeovers in his shop. He didn't have to get new equipment. He didn't have to change out his supply chain base. He's talking about ease of manufacturing. Ease of assembly, designed for assembly, right, are these choices we make to assemble the product a little bit easier based on the number of parts, how we ship it, how we're handling it, how I incorporate it onto site, right? So is that panel, the design for assembly instructions he gave, he would say, this is top picked. I need some eye hooks here. This is going to go on a truck. I put 5 on a truck. It gets integrated like this. You shoot it into that's all the instructions you need to know to assemble it in the easiest way possible. And we need to design that to enable that assembly to be easier, because that's where a lot of the money is on this site, right? On the site usually. They have a lot of things in common. They're trying to reduce material and overhead and labor and shorten the design cycle. They're really trying to standardize a lot of things. So here's what gets complicated about prefabrication. We talked a little bit about curtain wall systems. Imagine if you didn't have all that information from the curtain wall company up front in the design process. It would basically be impossible for you to use some of those companies, because we can't expect architects and engineers to know every single DFMA principle for every single prefabricated element and every single proprietary prefabricated element that's going to be coming through in a design, right? So there are generic DFMA principles, and I'll show you some of them, like design it once and use it many times. Those things I can apply to all of these pieces and parts you see here. But an element-specific DFMA principle would be like for the bathroom pod, where I want a single point of connection to make it easier to inspect on site and make the connections on site like plug and play. And so that's very element-specific. And that's where it gets really complicated. That's one of the ways that Autodesk can really help. We're enabling a framework and with our partners in lots of other places to really create that framework from concept to understand your options all the way through completion and operations. It's that DFMA intent for those specific elements that we can really, get you smarter on. So, and that's not just for creating the building, but I ask myself all the time, why do we have 50-year plus lifespan buildings when tech changes like every 2 years, right? So, and why am I making a 50-year plus lifespan building if there will be newer materials and better materials out sooner rather than later? So I think a lot about design for manufacturing and assembly in terms of disassembly and reuse, not just for some of the stuff we saw in COVID, where we wanted to make sure that we could take things apart and put them back together whenever we needed to move some of these prefabricated hospitals, but also for permanent structures where I know I'm going to want to scale up with capacity, like data centers, or I may want a technology swap out, like something like a semiconductor fab facility, or even a hospital that's going to have different technology in the MRI or the operating rooms or some of the modalities that are there. So I really want to start thinking about disassembly and reuse for scalability and the technology swaps. Of course, by the way, that also helps with sustainability. That's the purpose of circular economy. But I think we can think about it and expand the definition for sustainability. So DFMA principles that are generic in nature, these are the ones that I teach for the most part. So things like obviously design for ease of fabrication and ease of assembly. Modular, not volumetric block modular design, but more like what pieces and parts can create as many different outcomes as possible. And then maximizing multi-trade elements when I have adjacencies. Designing it once, using it many times, we talked about. I want to use things for multi-use. So if I'm creating an assembly, can I also make that assembly a structure that something else needs to sit on? Can I make it, use it in a different way so that it really creates a better value? Using of standard components, the lead times are better, it's easier, it helps with manufacturing as well. But advanced building products, as we mentioned, and safety and design is a big one, right? So how do I create this element to make sure that somebody doesn't need to install it by getting on a ladder or by utilizing a crane if they don't need to? How do I make it easier and even just safety and design for operations later, how do I make that so that that guy who needs to change the filter out on that piece of equipment doesn't have to stand on a step stool? He can do it right from the floor. So when I'm doing this, I'm also balancing the ease of fabrication with ease of assembly. That's a little bit more of an art form, unless you're using generative design like we have at Autodesk, where we're enabling some of the generative design concepts with prefabrication so that I can really understand what the right selection of pieces and parts are. Usually assembly is a little bit more expensive on the choice if I negate that choice than it is on fabrication. It just depends on the volume and how much the change needs to be made in the factory versus what the impact of cost is on assembly. So we always talk about like housing and hotels for prefab, all those sexy stories. I don't know why. But what I'm finding is there's a lot more work being done right now in some of the high tech jobs where there's a lot more MEP, right? So that makes sense. For those of you that are subcontractors out there, there's a lot of work being done by the really good MEP super subs and some of the general contractors that are integrating vertically. So the benefits of prefab, I mean, safety is always top of mind right now. I'm weeding a little bit of COVID into this. Obviously, you guys are running into things like temperature screenings and extended PPE and, hand washing and all kinds of stuff. The number one way you can actually create a safer job site, there's only really one way that trumps all other ways. And here's what it is. Just get rid of the people on the job site. Exponentially, you'll be increasing safety by removing people from the site and putting them in a more conducive and controlled environment like a factory. So that is literally the number one way you can create a safer job site is by utilizing prefabrication, getting people off the job site. This one happens to be Factory OS. It's easier to implement safety precautions in a factory. It can be cleaner, contained in smaller work areas. And, we can implement some easier protocols within a factory. We know right now that some jobs have been stopped and some are delayed. So we understand that out there. Some of the ways that a lot of people are talking about catching up is going to be by utilizing prefab. We know that in the latest study with McKinsey that they're talking a lot about both prefabrication and modular, which again, they've sort of mixed up some words here. So keep that in mind. Modular and offsite construction, two totally different things. It's almost like saying volumetric modules and prefab. Maybe they mean modules and all other prefab. Is going to be estimated adoption alone can lead to a savings of about $22 billion a year. So that's an interesting study that just came out. And there's some good topics on there about how they made 9 recommendations and they said industrialized construction would impact all of those in the future. So if you're not thinking about this, I have a client that says this is no longer a journey. It's actually a race, right? If you're not looking at industrialized construction like a race, you're already at the end of the pack. So it's all about certainty for the benefits, right? So this is a study that was done by the Lean Construction Institute. The orange projects you see there are typical projects. And the blue ones are actually the best projects that these clients at large capital projects judged. Typical projects are 50% over budget and 61% late. They are, the best projects ever are almost 20% over budget and also 21% behind schedule. Why does prefabrication have to enable us to be cheaper and faster? So I asked that because somebody on those jobs that was late and more than their budget said best project ever, right? I actually don't need to be that much sooner because I could really, if everything is most projects are 61% behind schedule. What am I doing if I'm even only 25%, behind schedule? That would be a monumental increase, but I'm always shooting for on time and on budget. That's what we want to shoot for right now, prefabrication, is that certainty, that predictability, utilizing IC and the data to get certainty, right? So I never talk about savings in the sense until we're getting really good at this. I want to talk about smoothing out the labor on the job site, getting more control, potentially shorter schedules depending on what you can build concurrently, like I talked about, and just having an easier job site to manage, right? Like reduce site disruption and an easier job site to manage. There's lots of numbers also in this Dodge report that if you want to read about how prefabrication is helping with some of the metrics that we typically looked at. I'm happy to see they're not talking so much about savings. They've adopted our language at Autodesk, which is about certainty and predictability. So I really appreciate that. And I like to think about things in terms of the breakdown, right? We're seeing a lot of growth in the next 3 years in single trade. I think it's even more than this because I don't think we have our hands wrapped around how much single trade is actually happening. But even without that, this is a tremendous growth for not only what's happening now, but what's coming in single trade. The same thing in multi-trade growth, right? So of all things, that's going to make a big difference because we're going to do more with less, hopefully, with multi-trade. And almost 60% growth they're expecting in the next 3 years. So that's huge. The MEP contractors are leading the way. For those of you who are my engineers and my MEP contractors, fantastic. And I'm realizing on the questions that we asked, we didn't ask anybody if they're general contractors. I'm assuming my general contractors, my builders are in that other category and my subcontractors. So I'm going to count you in that group over there. So let's think about the MEP contractors really leading the way. And these are some pictures of some of the stuff that I've worked on with some great guys. Some of the really cool stuff that's happening. Again, you see heavy tech influence in those modules on the left, and then some really cool single trade some assemblies from Poole and Kent there that you see on the right. Star Electric on the left and Poole and Kent, two great companies that I've worked with and been lucky enough to do a lot of prefab with. But easier is the question. It always leads to better and faster and ends up being more value. I don't ask people if what they're doing is cheaper, just like with that firecock or the blaze frame. I'm looking for flow. Manufacturers look for flow. We look for things that are easier to manage, easier to produce, easier to make. And that always results in things that are better and faster. It's like, is it easier to stand on the ladder and work upside down or ergonomically at the table? How much more work will I get done if I'm comfortable sitting down in a lighted area that's clean? Easier is the question I always ask myself. And if you're an estimator on this call, we don't have too many of them, but I always say, like, stop letting your bosses ask you if it's cheaper. That's the wrong question, right? You've got some great prefabrication. I'm doing a shout out to some of my old clients and some really great friends of mine at PCL. They have a factory called Agile. They're doing both volumetric modular construction and prefabrication there. Really fantastic company out there. Another shout out, just some of the jobs they're doing. They're doing such great stuff. You've got great prefab in Canada. And you've also got some other manufacturers like NRB who actually just got acquired, but they do some great permanent large-scale prefab as well. And so again, we just want to enable more stuff going on. And so if you'd like to learn about any of the things that are going on around the world, we can certainly help you at our knowledge base at Autodesk and give you some help. Why hasn't it happened though? So if this is so great, why hasn't it happened? We have to stop being so siloed, right? So we think of things in terms of silos all the time. We also have to stop thinking of things in very trade-centric methodologies. All of our tools are trade-centric. Think about estimating, think about scheduling. We have to become more element-centric, including our DFMA. We have to think about assembling design. I always say, listen, guys, you will never assemble construction if you stick-build design. It's just that simple, right? Like, you cannot stick-build design and think that you're going to assemble construction. So we also, let's face it, we have a hard to change culture. We've got a lot of, I won't say guys, a lot of people beating on their chest. We've done it this way for a really long time. And all of our tools and contracts and procurement methodologies are set up as trade-centric. Even though you're doing lean, it doesn't mean that prefab is enabled, just for the record. And I have a whole nother presentation on lean and prefab. Just because you bring people up to the front of the process doesn't mean that they're going to actually prefabricate things, just so you know. And we have to start really walking the walk that we talk about Productivity and sustainability and social good. So we really need to expand our definitions about sustainability into economic sustainability, industry sustainability. And again, we've got to stop being so project-centric. Late engagement always kills prefab. You got to do this before there's even a job. That's why we're out here educating, right? That silly apples to oranges comparison. Yes, firecock is cheaper than blaze frame. It doesn't mean better. It doesn't mean easier. It doesn't mean better flow. It doesn't mean overall the life cycle of the cost is more expensive. So we have to think about things differently. Start asking if it's easier and not asking if it's cheaper. The conventional procurement process doesn't work. We need to understand how to get integrated up front, not just with getting the people up there, but having the right software and the framework to collaborate over the course of the project. It's actually less about getting the knowledgeable people up front and more about being able to share that knowledge across the platform with more and more people. So again, if you haven't gotten digitized, we really have to get aligned. When I have clients that say we're doing this to be cheaper, I just tell them that I'm probably not the right group to work with them. We do have a consulting practice at Autodesk where we help people get on the journey. And when they say we want to do it to lower our costs, my first question is, you think you're going to start something brand new without any skill set and all of a sudden you're going to be cheaper your first time out. That's not really how learning works, right? So we need to get off, just being single element focused, and we need to get off our project centricity. I like clients that are in it for the long game. You have to think of factories, fabricators, we think long game. Because there's a learning curve, right? You're not going to put a piece of machinery on your factory floor and be better at it than that by hand process in the beginning. First, you have to learn. Then it becomes repeatable. Once you can repeat it and you can share that across the platform, you can define it better. You can tweak it. You can, make it that iterative process to make things better and better and better. On a factory floor, when you have many jobs going down, you can learn something on one job and instantly apply it in the factory to the next job going down the floor to make it better. It's very hard to do that in construction, but in manufacturing, that's very easy. We can then manage it and optimize it, right? That's important. So we need this because we have a skills gap and we have productivity. I don't want to show the productivity chart like everybody else does over and over again, but jobs are getting harder and we have less labor. And we do need growth for our businesses and improve sustainability in the most broad form of the term, right? We need industry sustainability right now more than anything else. And really it's about reducing risk, right? That's what this is really about for the owners. And I think you'll see a lot more of the owners demanding that people get digitized and get collaborative and think about things like industrialized construction. Because what we have now is faith, right? We all know that prefabrication in our hearts makes sense. We have some correlation, but unless you get digitized and get on the data and have a platform that you can actually work across that's seamless, it's very hard to have causation, right? You're very hard to have predictive analysis. It's very hard to have certainty. And that's what it's all about. So you've got to get on this journey so that you can get to causation as quickly as possible. You can download this report, The Future of Work in Construction, at Autodesk. It's very interesting about how this is going to change the jobs. I only bring this up as well for COVID because we have a lot of people in this world that are going to be out of work in lots of different countries. And we have an opportunity now to grab some of this talent and bring them over to our country, to our industry, and show them how great it is to be in the design, build, manufacturing environment. You'll see a lot of different skills out there, new teams. If you recognize any of these skills out there, people that are out of work, pick them up right away, because this is what we're going to go towards. We're going to go to new roles with new skills, with new collaborative teams that are going to be much more data focused, much more supply chain and manufacturing focused, and that are thinking more about things in terms of production. So the role of industry and government, the last thing I'll say about our industry is we have a responsibility to do this, not just as Autodesk, but also as an industry to get better so that we can survive and have sustainability for all of the people that live in our communities, because we are creating the future with construction and design. Role of government, if any of my guys on here are from the government, I always say, please don't give out any stimulus money unless you're going to require the use of BIM, prefabrication, and anything that has to do with collaborative software, so that we can actually get people to be in a better place so they can pivot. And next time something like this happens, we'll be that much more prepared. So with that, I'm going to take some questions, and I will close out the training portion of this. So if you have any questions, feel free to send them on our way.
Can you hear me, Amy?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Well, while they get their questions ready,
Yeah.
Just a couple questions for you here, and it's sort of two sides of the same coin here. Who in the AC industry have the most work to do to adopt these advanced construction principles? And then flip, the other side of the coin is who's already made the biggest strides? I think you answered that, but
Yeah. I think we all have a lot of work to do, right? I mean, maybe this will be a strange answer, but I'm going to put the onus on the big owners for a minute. Like, at the end of the day, if you have the money, you dictate the procedures, right? Like, so if you're the government and you have the money, or you're the big client that has, money to spend and you're doing all that work, you should require this. It's no longer about we're pushing risk and responsibility onto others. That takes collaborative work from those big owners. They need to really get involved, and instead of pushing risk onto others, they need to collaborate on removing risk where these things are. So I'd say, like, they have a lot to do. Obviously, I think, it's sort of even across the board, from the architects and the construction managers. Typically on jobs, honestly, they're the constraints, because they either don't know how to design for manufacturing and assembly, or their supply chain doesn't have a lot of partners for them. So they're afraid of, like, ditching their old partners that they've been with for 50 years and coming up with new partners. So I think, what's going to solve for that, obviously that's why I came to Autodesk. I think software will be a big help in solving for some of that, as well as I see the new manufacturer. It's sort of the rise of the subcontractor as the new manufacturer, especially those guys that have heavy MEP or structural background, because that's really what it's going to end up being about. So love to see those guys rise up to the future. And they are, really, to be honest. They're doing the best jobs right now.
That answers it. Yeah. And I love that point about don't be shipping air. I thought that was very eye-opening. There's another question here from Kristen Silva.
Sure.
What is the biggest barrier to prefab in Canada? Is it the lack of BIM mandates?
I think BIM mandates is critical. So if you are a government entity right now, we have to have BIM mandates, not just for things like transportation. We need them for what's really critical infrastructure. So we need critical infrastructure in healthcare. We need critical infrastructure in data centers and telecom. We need critical infrastructure in people that have places to live right now. So I think the BIM mandate is really a fantastic step that government needs to take. It needs to be coupled with not just BIM mandate, but collaborative use of software, like in the cloud, so that we're not on-prem. We don't have software that's sitting on servers that when there's an issue like we have now that we can't get back to our offices. So you have to get on the cloud and digitize along with BIM. And you need to create more of a industrialized construction environment to have things built in factories. So like we had some great guys that pivoted and did some cool stuff in hospitals that were already fabricating, right? So they could pivot and change and do some other things. If you're starting from scratch, that's nearly impossible to pivot. It's why I always say, it's like, why is a alcohol distillery able to make hand sanitizer all of a sudden? Why did Louis Vuitton make ventilator masks? And in construction, we can't get out a prefabricated hospital bed, well, because they're manufacturers and we're typically site building things. So how do you organize if you have no central place for learning, which is really takes place a lot of times in the factory to pivot? That's a great question.
Yeah, and actually, there's more, a lot more here. I'm just looking in the Q&A here. So from Patricia, Patricia, do you see prefab having more use in smaller projects like small building residential?
Yeah. So there is a market for small building residential right now, as well as like adaptable dwelling units. If you know what that, the really small units that are actually by code allowed to be put in the back of your home, typically, like they're called ADUs. So for homes and ADUs, I think there is a market for it. The one thing you have to recognize about it is usually they don't ship very far. So that market tends to be a bit fragmented and spread out. It's a good market within that geo, but it doesn't necessarily mean like you can have those small structures shipping to Africa. Like when I build a data center here in the US and I ship to Africa, that's not expensive air, right? That's cheap air I'm shipping because it's so packed full of stuff. So I think it really just depends on the application. But yeah, there is a market for that. It tends to be somewhat geo-focused.
Okay, great. Lots more questions here.
Yeah.
Do you think the industry, this is from Tom, do you think the industry should move to multi-project procurements instead of a client making each contractor compete on each project?
Yeah.
Would this create a better flow for supply chain, volume, kit of parts, etc.?
Okay, I don't know who Tom S is, but make sure you reach out to me on LinkedIn, because this is already happening, by the way. It's happening more in Asia than it's happening out in Canada. I mean, sometimes in Canada, what holds you guys back is that PPP methodology. Everything's already almost designed before we get on the job. It's like, it's very hard to impact things that have already been designed, right? And if you don't understand these concepts and don't know the supply chain and what's there's so little innovation when you do it that way. So I think PPP, like P3 projects, are holding you back. And I think one of the things that I've seen in Asia, people are adopting more and more, is I always say the number one transactional waste in construction is bidding. Like, we should partner. That's it. And if you're CyrusOne and data centers here, they talked about that too, how they've lowered their cost through partnering, working with the same partners on multiple projects. It's because the learning takes place. Not only the contracts, by the way, you'll see they're going to ask for dedicated staff that have to show up. Not just that you get this company, but you get those people. It's the people almost that are more important than, especially if you're just getting used to new processes. But yes, it's happening now.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm sure Tom, I have an idea who that might be. I'm sure he'll reach out to you.
Right.
Cry, with Autodesk Revit not built to deal with modular repetition, doesn't like repeating group families, cannot include walls. Is the technology/industry ready for this change? Will we see architectural projects having to shift to manufacturing software, or a combination of the two?
Yeah, I think here's the good news, right? The good news is that Autodesk, this is why I came, right? I looked around, I left my company not because it wasn't successful, I had a great career, but I can only make so much change as a small woman-owned company working globally. And when you look at Autodesk, there is Revit, but there's also things like Inventor, and we have other software here that integrates with all of these things. And I think the functionality that is being enabled with some of the plugins that are being built right now and that are built right now through Inventor and through some other things like Dynamo and some other things that we have, there's a lot of stuff that if you have a need that you want the software to work a very particular way, you need to reach out. So I would tell you that there's probably more solutions than you think. And obviously SolidCAD is one of our partners that can help you with some of those solutions. And we at Autodesk, can work with SolidCAD and directly with you to make sure that what it is that you're looking for, you get what you need. I also do a lot of research projects and a lot of stuff on understanding any of the data workflow. So if you have an issue, especially when it comes to IC, call me and I'd be happy to walk you through some things or talk to you about what's there and what's not and how to best deal with it.
Great answer. And I'd welcome Cry to reach out to SolidCAD as well. Myself, yeah. We can certainly help. We're helping companies specifically with that. So yeah, great. Thank you, Amy. Okay, here's a good one. Great presentation, Amy. Real big fan. I was wondering, my background is in electrical. So how would one approach adopting prefab with a mix of the old guard in the shop and the younger tech-savvy field workers?
That's awesome. So, I mean,
Victor.
look, I always say it's not, I usually use the word pipe. My dad said stay away from electrical, so I didn't hurt myself, for the record. My dad is a contractor. I grew up in construction. But I think, look, I always say to the companies, if you've ever listened to anything I talk about, it's not hard to prefabricate pipe, right? It's hard to have a culture and leadership and process that enables fabricating pipe, right? Or same thing for electrical. I think with electrical, guys, I mean, most of the electricians I know are super smart, for the record. And I think, look, this is going to sound awful, but some of those guys are retiring or they're moving on. And sometimes we have to wait for that if we're not in the right company. Or you just need to find some of the great companies that are out there, like Faith. They have their Accelerate side. You've got MC Dean. You've got Rosendin. You've got, lots of great electrical companies that actually see the vision and have created. I'm talking about that have put tens of millions of dollars into their fab shops. So if your company isn't that company, yes, you can stay there and you can try to impact change from within. But certainly the talent is out there to go and find some of these big electrical contractors that are really more like fabricator super subs. But yeah, I think, look, I'm happy to, as a favor, anytime, go and talk to any of your C-suite and talk to them about what's going on in the world. Sometimes they just don't know, and that they think it hasn't hit them yet, but it's really going on around them all the time.